Hi everyone, I've got something a little bit different for you today. In this video I'll share a few different techniques I use when I work with watercolour pencils. I have accumulated a heap of watercolour pencils over the years, and I must admit that I rarely use them, but I've had a few people ask me if I do a tutorial with them. So I used them to paint this little bird of paradise flower painting. In the past, I may have used them over the top of a watercolour painting to enhance it, but I've never used them on their own like I have with this painting. So it was good for me to have a bit of a play with them. I also did the same painting with watercolour paint so that I could compare the two. I like to use hot pressed or smooth paper when I use pencils. So I used some Arches hot pressed watercolour paper. I don't have a preference for any particular brand of watercolour pencil because I haven't used them enough and I don't know a lot about them. So I can't talk about the differences in the brands. For this painting, I used mainly Derwent watercolour pencils. A lot of people like to use these water brushes to activate the watercolour pencil. You fill them with water and that saves you having to dip into your water container all the time. I find the bristles are a bit stiff and clunky on my watercolour brush, so I prefer to use my watercolour brushes. In this video, you'll see me use a Da Vinci Maestro No. 2 round brush to activate the pencil. And I'll show you a few different ways to get the pigment on the paper. This is the photo that I took of the flower. They've got these growing en masse at the shopping centre where I get my groceries. So when they were flowering recently, I took a few photos with my phone. The most obvious way to use watercolour pencils is to draw with them directly onto dry paper. I started by using a yellow pencil to draw in all the yellow areas that I saw on the petals. Once I got all the yellow parts covered, I switched to an orange pencil and I started to draw in all the orange areas that I could see. I press really lightly with the pencil and I keep the strokes going in the same direction that the petal is going. Up and down, very gentle. Here you can see a little bit closer. Very, very light strokes. I'm trying to keep it as neat as I can too. I don't like to press too heavily because I'm not a fan of the linear look that watercolour pencils can give you work. Once I activate the pencil with water, I'm hoping to not see too many pencil strokes. I'm eager to have a look at it now, so I'm going to activate that with some water. For that, I'm going to use my No. 2 Da Vinci Maestro round brush. This brush has got a really fine tip that I can get into all the nooks and crannies with, and I'd prefer to use this than those water brushes that you can use and fill with water. The bristles I find are too thick and stumpy, so that's why I'm using this brush. I've got more control with this brush. I wet it with water and then I paint over my pencil lines with it. Every time I need more water, all I do is dip it into my water container. You can still see a few pencil lines after I've activated it, but by pressing lightly with my pencil when I put it on, I'll keep those lines to a minimum. I'll show you what I mean here on a scrap piece of paper. Here I'm pressing lightly with the watercolour pencil. Put the pigment on the paper with very little pressure. And now I'll press heavier with the pencil. I'll activate the light one. You can still see the pencil lines, but they're quite faint. Now I'll wet this one. You can still see my pencil lines under there. So I prefer to press lightly first to get my lightest values, and then I layer more pigment over the top when I want to increase the values. I'll show you different ways of layering the pigment in this video. This colour won't be dark enough and I'll need to layer some more coloured pencil over the top. And as I said, I'd prefer to do that than to put the pigment on too dark to begin with. I can always make it darker, but I can't make it lighter. I've just put some colour on the other two and now I'm activating it here. I wet the yellow areas first and then I wet the orange areas. That was to keep the yellow yellow instead of putting the orange over the top of it. I'll do the same thing here. I'll wet the yellow parts first and then I'll wet the orange parts. Otherwise I'll drag the orange into the yellow and I'll probably lose a lot of the yellow. So now I'll wet the brush again and then wet the orange parts. I can still see those lines made by the pencils there, but I know that if I had pressed heavier I'd probably see more lines. But hopefully when I start to layer over the top I'll lose a lot of those pencil lines. Now I want to get some colour onto the leaf that's protecting the flower. So I'll call this the sheath. So I'm using some orange on the front. I can see some orange on the reference photo. This is my Rose Madder Lake pink pencil. I can see some pink on the reference photo, so I'll draw that on where I see the pink. There'll be quite a few different colours on this sheath or leaf. I'm putting a bit more orange on the front. And this one here is mineral green. So I can see some green on the reference photo. I think that green will be too bright. So I've got some golden brown here that I'm going to draw over the top of it. So I'll put the green down first and then I'll use the golden brown over the top to tone it down a bit because I fear that this green will be too bright. I don't have a lot of green watercolour pencils, so I didn't have a lot to choose from. But I'm hoping if I mix these two colours by drawing them over the top of one another, that should work out okay. So this is golden brown. It's going over the top of the green. Now I'm using a violet pencil. This is a different brand. It's Caran d'Ache. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that properly. The colour here is periwinkle blue. And this is a bit of the orange again. And I can see some green here. And this is the brown going over the top of the green to tone it down. All right, let's have a look at this and see what it looks like. I think what I'll do when I transition from one colour to the other, I might dip my brush in the water again to get off the other colour. So I've just dipped it in the water then to get the green off it so that I could get the pink coming on there. I didn't want to dirty the pink with the green if I could help it. Okay, so that's one way of getting the pigment on the paper. Use the watercolour pencil to draw gently on the paper and then wet it with some water to activate it. This is what it looked like with that first layer of colour on the paper. Now I have to start to build the colour up and add more detail. To compare, this is the watercolour painting that I did of the same flower and it's got its first layer of paint on it here. To start to add more depth, more colour, I can do the same thing. I can draw directly onto the paper and then wet the watercolour pencil with my brush again. Another way that you can use watercolour pencils is to take the pigment from the pencil itself with the brush. So if I take my orange pencil and use my wet brush to wipe over it, I can pick up a bit of pigment on my brush and then I can use that to paint on the colour. I'll put a bit more colour on the left hand side as well. I'll do the same thing. I'll wipe the brush over the pencil and then I use that pigment that I've just picked up to paint on. Doing it this way, I can avoid those linear textured pencil marks that I don't particularly like. I'm working on dry paper here as well. So that's allowed me to add that detail onto that petal. Because it's only a small flower, a little bit of the colour goes a fairly long way. This is my watercolour painting of the same flower, and one of my favourite techniques is to work wet on wet. So here I'm wetting the paper with water. Then I get my paint and I paint onto the paper while it's wet. That gives me those soft paint edges. I can do the same thing on my watercolour pencil drawing. Here I'm wetting it with water. Pick up the pigment and then I can paint it onto the wet paper. The same way I do when I paint with watercolour paint. And you can see that that has also given me those soft paint edges because I'm painting on the wet paper. Up the top though, the paper is dry, so it's giving me those hard edges. When I paint with watercolour paint, I often drop one colour onto another while the paper's wet. I can do that here with these pencils as well. So that's some orange going over the top of the brown while it's wet. Now I'll use my clean brush just to spread that out a little bit. Here I'm using some orange, but my paper has dried. So I'm painting that on the dry paper to increase the colour. This is another way that I can use the watercolour pencils. If I get a scrap piece of paper, I can rub some of the pigment onto the paper quite dark. And then I use a wet brush to pick up the pigment. Here I'm painting on the dry paper. That will increase the colour on this petal. I could give it another layer by drawing directly onto the paper, but then I risk those linear pencil lines that I said that I'm not keen on. Here I've wet my paper and I'm using my brush to pick up the pigment from the pencil itself. And I start to layer this over the top. So the paper's wet there. I'm wetting the paper again there, and I'll get some orange. Take it from the pencil itself. And I paint that onto the wet paper. And where the orange meets the pink, I'll get soft blended edges because the paper is wet. Here I've got a bit of the green. Now I'm wetting the front of it. I don't wet it all at once because it will dry before I get to paint on it. It's the orange again. I could have used this technique right at the start instead of drawing with the pencil on the paper, but I wanted to show you a few different techniques. I continued to layer the pigment to deepen the colour in the areas that I needed to. And to do that, I mainly wiped my wet brush over the pencil to pick up the pigment. So here I've got some Prussian blue and I'm layering it over the top of the periwinkle blue. That was the violet colour. That's on dry paper there. And just here I've decided that my pink isn't bold enough. So I've wet that with water. I've got the pink pencil. This is Rose Madder Lake. Wipe my brush over it and then I put a bit more pigment there. to finish off, I'll deepen the shadow along the bottom here with some more Prussian blue, so another layer. I gradually build up the colour by layering the pigment, the same way I layer the pigment on my watercolour paintings. And there it is finished. Here I've got the watercolour pencil drawing on the left and the watercolour painting on the right. Another way that I'll sometimes use watercolour pencils is I'll wet the paper and then I'll draw on the paper directly with the pencil, which I did when I painted the boat a few weeks ago. This is my boat painting that I did a few weeks ago. I wet the area with some water and then I used the watercolour pencil dry on top of the wet paper. And that left a soft mark or a soft reflection in the water for me. I've wet the paper here as well. I enjoyed working with them. I think that they'd be great to take on a holiday with you if you wanted to do a bit of painting, because they'd be easier than packing paints and palettes. One thing I'd like to mention is that when you saw me wipe my brush over the pencil, I had it directly over the top of my painting. It's a good idea to do that away from your painting because your brush can slip and then you can accidentally flick pigment all over the paper where you don't want it. I did it under the camera so that you could see what I was doing. So just be mindful of that. I hope this was useful to you. I will make a full-length tutorial of both of these little paintings for my Patreon site, and I'll put them on there in January. Please give this video a like and make sure you subscribe to my channel if you don't already. If you celebrate Christmas, I wish you a beautiful day next week. I hope it's filled with family and lots of love. Stay safe and I'll see you in the new year. Hi everything. Got something a little bit different for you today. Hi everything. Did it again. Hi everything. Hi everyone. Hi everyone, I've got something a little bit different for you today. In this video I'll share a few different techniques I use when I work with coloured pencils. Not coloured pencils, watercolour pencils. The Da Vinci Maestro number 2 round brush to activate the watercolour pencil. And I'll show you a few different waters to get the pigment on the paper. So you can use a few different waters. Yep. Painting, because they'd be easier.